The rain poured heavily that night, the sky dark and merciless, as if the heavens themselves had conspired against her. Amara stood outside the grand mansion she had once called her workplace, shivering in the cold. Her clothes were soaked, her bare feet pressed against the wet pavement, but none of that pain compared to the ache in her heart. Just an hour ago, she had been inside, scrubbing the floors as she always did, minding her business, staying out of trouble. And yet, trouble had found her. Thief! Vanessa's sharp voice had sliced through the air like a knife. Amara had turned, confused, her hands still damp from the mop she had been holding. She barely had time to react before Mrs. Daniels stormed into the room, her eyes blazing with anger. In Vanessa's hands was a delicate golden necklace, one that Amara had seen her wear many times before. "She stole it, Mom. I left it in my room, and now it's in the laundry basket. Who else could it be?" Vanessa sneered, stepping closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the space between them. Amara's lips trembled. I don't know how it got there, I swear. I didn't touch it." Mrs. Daniels didn't care. She never had. To her, Amara was nothing but a servant, a disposable worker she had tolerated for too long. "Enough of your lies," Mrs. Daniels hissed, her voice laced with disgust. "I have been too kind to you, letting you live under my roof, feeding you, giving you a job, and this is how you repay me?" Amara's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Madam, I swear on my life, I didn't take it. I have never stolen anything." But her pleas meant nothing. "Get out." The words were final, a cold, unforgiving sentence that stripped her of everything in an instant. She had begged, she had pleaded, but Mrs. Daniels had grabbed her by the arm and dragged her to the front door. The other maids stood watching from a distance, their eyes filled with pity, but none of them dared to speak. They all knew the wrath of Mrs. Daniels was not something to be challenged. With one last shove, Amara was thrown out into the stormy night. The door slammed behind her, locking her out of the only place she had known for the past 4 years. She stood there, frozen, rain dripping from her hair, the bitter taste of betrayal coating her tongue. She had no family to run to, no home waiting for her. Her parents had died years ago, leaving her to survive on her own. She had thought working for the Daniels family would give her a chance at life, but in the end, they had discarded her like trash. As she walked aimlessly through the dark streets, her mind screamed with unanswered questions. Why had Vanessa framed her? Had she done it out of pure cruelty, or was there something more? Her stomach growled in hunger, but there was no food, no shelter. The city was ruthless, especially to someone like her. She stopped under a street lamp, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to keep warm. A car passed by, splashing water onto her already drenched clothes. She barely flinched. What was the point? She had lost everything. Just as she was about to sit on the cold pavement, a pair of bright headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the rain like two burning eyes. The black luxury car slowed down as it approached her, and for the first time that night, a small flicker of fear crept into her heart. Rich men in fancy cars never stopped for poor, homeless girls like her. The car came to a halt right in front of her. The driver's door opened, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out, his silhouette strong and commanding under the dim streetlight. Amara's breath hitched. The man was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, the kind only the wealthiest could afford. His sharp jawline, piercing dark eyes, and neatly trimmed hair gave him an air of untouchable power. Even through the darkness, his presence was overwhelming. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Then, without a word, he took a step closer. Amara's heart pounded. Who was this man? And why had he stopped for her? Before she could find her voice, his deep, authoritative tone cut through the silence. "Get in." Her body tensed. Every warning in her mind screamed at her to run. She didn't know this man. He could be dangerous. But what choice did she have? Her feet refused to move, uncertainty holding her in place. He exhaled, his eyes studying her with something close to impatience. "It's either you get in, or you freeze to death on these streets." Amara swallowed hard. A part of her wanted to resist, to reject his offer and keep whatever dignity she had left. But another part, the desperate, starving, hopeless part, knew she wouldn't survive the night on her own. She glanced at the mansion she had once called home, now just a distant memory. Then, slowly, Hesitantly, she took a step forward and climbed into the car of the stranger who would change her life forever. The car's interior was like nothing Amara had ever seen before. The seats were covered in the softest leather, the air smelled of expensive cologne, and soft instrumental music played in the background. It was a world completely different from the one she had just been thrown into, the cold, wet streets where she had nowhere to go. She sat stiffly, barely breathing, her hands gripping the edge of her tattered dress. The man beside her hadn't said another word since she got in. His eyes remained on the road, his fingers expertly controlling the wheel as the car glided through the night. The silence between them was suffocating, but Amara didn't dare break it. She stole a glance at him. His profile was sharp, his jaw tense, as if he carried a weight no one else could see. There was an air of authority around him, something that told her he wasn't just any rich man, he was someone powerful. After what felt like forever, he finally spoke. "What's your name?" His voice was deep, smooth, and commanding. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amara." "Amara what?" She swallowed. "Just Amara." He glanced at her briefly, his dark eyes piercing. Then he turned back to the road. "You have no home?" She shook her head, her fingers tightening in her lap. "No." "No family?" "No." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he pressed a button on the dashboard, and within seconds, the temperature inside the car became warmer. Amara felt the heat seep into her frozen skin, but it did nothing to melt the ice of fear sitting in her stomach. "Where were you before I found you?" he asked. Amara's throat tightened. The memories were still fresh, the pain still raw. "I worked as a maid for the Daniels family," she said, her voice trembling. "They threw me out tonight. Accused me of stealing." His fingers tapped against the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. "Did you?" Amara's head snapped toward him, shock flashing in her eyes. "No, I would never." His lips curled slightly, almost as if he had expected her reaction. People lie when they're desperate. Anger burned in her chest. She was many things, poor, helpless, abandoned, but she was not a liar. "I'm telling the truth," she said firmly. For the first time, his lips curved into something that resembled a smirk. "Good," he said simply, as if testing her reaction. She frowned. "You don't believe me, do you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the car into the driveway of a building so grand, Amara's breath hitched. The structure stood tall, modern glass windows reflecting the city lights, a masterpiece of wealth and elegance. This wasn't just a hotel, it was a place only the richest of the rich could afford to step into. The car came to a smooth stop, and the man stepped out first. A valet rushed to open Amara's door, but she hesitated, her mind spinning. Why had he brought her here? She looked up to see him watching her, his sharp gaze unwavering. "Are you coming out, or would you rather sleep in the car?" Amara swallowed hard, then slowly stepped out. The cold wind hit her immediately, but before she could react, he was already walking toward the entrance. She had no choice but to follow. The moment they entered, heads turned. Staff members bowed slightly, their faces filled with recognition. This man was important, that much was clear. A woman in a crisp black uniform approached. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell. Will you be needing your usual suite?" Amara froze. "Mr. Blackwell?" Her mind raced. She had heard that name before. Ethan Blackwell. A billionaire businessman, one of the most powerful men in the city. Her heart pounded. She had gotten into the car of a man who could buy and sell lives with a snap of his fingers. Ethan nodded to the woman. "Yes, and get her some warm clothes." The woman's eyes flickered to Amara, surprise flashing in them before she nodded and disappeared. Amara shifted uncomfortably. She was used to being invisible, but now people were staring, whispering. Ethan turned to her. "Come." She followed him into the private elevator, her heart thudding with every floor they passed. When the doors finally opened, they stepped into a suite so massive, Amara almost forgot how to breathe. The walls were lined with expensive artwork, the furniture sleek and modern. A giant window overlooked the city, its lights twinkling like stars. Everything screamed wealth. Ethan removed his jacket and tossed it onto the couch before turning to her. "Bathrooms through there. Go take a hot shower. There'll be clothes waiting for you when you're done." Amara hesitated. Why are you helping me?" He leaned against the counter, studying her. "Does it matter?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely steady. "It does." He exhaled, then folded his arms. I don't do things for free, Amara. I helped you because I need something in return. Her heart stopped. There it was, the catch. She took a step back, panic rising in her chest. If you're expecting... Relax, he interrupted, his tone calm but firm. I don't need what you're thinking. A lump formed in her throat. Then what? His gaze darkened. A job. She blinked. A job? Yes, you'll work for me. Amara was still processing his words when the hotel staff returned, carrying a neatly folded set of clothes. She placed them on the bed before bowing slightly and leaving. Ethan's eyes met hers again. Go freshen up. We'll talk after. Amara hesitated, but the warmth of the shower was too tempting to ignore. Without another word, she disappeared into the bathroom, locking the door behind her. Under the steaming water, she finally let out the breath she had been holding. She had gone from being homeless to standing in the suite of one of the richest men in the country, and now he was offering her a job. But why her? What kind of job did he expect her to do? And most importantly, could she trust him? As the steam curled around her, she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. And whatever awaited her next would change her life forever. Amara stepped out of the bathroom, her body wrapped in a plush white robe, her damp hair cascading over her shoulders. She felt different, almost as if the hot water had washed away the pain of the past few hours. But deep inside, uncertainty still clawed at her chest. The luxurious suite still felt unreal, the kind of place she had only seen in magazines. The soft carpet beneath her feet, the expensive paintings on the walls, the breathtaking view of the city. It was a world that didn't belong to her. And then there was him, Ethan Blackwell, the billionaire who had picked her up from the streets and brought her here. She found him seated on the couch, his sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. A glass of whiskey sat in his hand, but his eyes were on her. Studying. Calculating. She swallowed hard. You said you have a job for me, she said, breaking the silence. Ethan nodded and gestured for her to sit. Amara hesitated before slowly lowering herself onto the couch opposite him. I need a personal assistant, he said smoothly, taking a sip of his drink. Amara's brows furrowed. A personal assistant? Yes, Ethan replied. Someone to organize my schedule, handle my calls, and take care of personal errands. His gaze darkened. Someone I can trust. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, she had feared something worse. But why me? She asked, her voice uncertain. A smirk tugged at the corner of Ethan's lips. I have my reasons. She frowned. That wasn't an answer. He placed his glass down and leaned forward slightly. The job pays well. You'll have a place to stay, food to eat, and you won't have to worry about being thrown into the streets again. The offer was tempting, too tempting. But something about it didn't sit right. Why do you trust me? She blurted. Ethan tilted his head. Do I? Her lips parted slightly. Trust is earned, Amara, he continued. And I don't trust easily. His voice dropped slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. But I have a feeling about you. A chill ran down her spine. She wanted to ask what kind of feeling, but she knew she wouldn't get a straight answer. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek phone. I'll have someone arrange proper documents for you. If you accept the job, you start tomorrow. Amara stared at the phone, her mind spinning. Was this really happening? A few hours ago, she had been sobbing in the streets, homeless and humiliated. Now, a billionaire was offering her a job and a new life. It almost felt too good to be true. She looked up at him. And if I say no? Ethan's expression remained unreadable. Then I'll have my driver drop you off wherever you want. Her stomach twisted. She had nowhere to go, no home, no family. If she stepped out of this suite, she'd be back in the cold, struggling to survive. She had no choice. I accept, she said softly. Ethan gave a small nod, as if he had expected her answer. He pressed a button on his phone. Within minutes, a woman in a sharp black suit entered the suite, carrying a folder. This is Ava, my legal assistant, Ethan said. She'll help you with the paperwork. Ava gave Amara a polite nod before placing the documents in front of her. Please read through and sign where necessary. Amara's fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the papers. She wasn't used to contracts or formalities. The words blurred before her eyes. She hesitated, then glanced up at Ethan. Do you have any questions? He asked. She did. 1,000,000 of them. But instead, she shook her head and picked up the pen. As she signed the contract, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a deal that would change her life forever. The next morning, Amara woke up in a bed so soft it felt like she was sleeping on clouds. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rays across the room. For a moment, she had forgotten where she was. Then everything came rushing back. The Daniels family, the accusations, the cold streets, Ethan Blackwell. She sat up abruptly. Today was her first day as his assistant. Nervous energy surged through her as she stepped out of bed and found a neatly folded outfit on a chair, an elegant yet simple black dress. She dressed quickly, then took a deep breath before stepping out of the room. Downstairs, Ethan was already waiting in the living area, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit. He barely glanced at her as he stood and walked toward the door. "Let's go," he said. Amara hurried after him, her heart pounding. A sleek black car was already waiting outside. The driver held the door open and Ethan slid in first. Amara hesitated before following. The ride to Ethan's office was silent. She stole glances at him, trying to understand this man who had turned her life upside down. His face was unreadable, his jaw clenched as he scrolled through his phone. He was a mystery, one she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. When they arrived at the towering Blackwell Enterprises building, Amara's breath hitched. The skyscraper loomed over the city, its glass windows reflecting the morning sun. This was his empire. Ethan stepped out first, striding toward the entrance without waiting for her. Amara hurried to keep up. The moment they entered, heads turned. Employees whispered, eyes flickering toward her. Who's she? Did Mr. Blackwell hire a new assistant? She doesn't look like she belongs here. Amara's stomach clenched. Ethan, however, didn't seem to care. He walked through the grand lobby without acknowledging the stares. When they reached his private office, he finally turned to her. "You'll be working directly under me," he said. "Your desk is outside my office. I expect you to be on time, efficient, and professional." Amara nodded, trying to steady her nerves. Ethan studied her for a moment, then turned away. "Let's see if you're as trustworthy as you claim to be." His words sent a chill down her spine. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, surrounded by people who didn't believe she belonged. And Ethan? He wasn't just her employer. He was a man who carried secrets. And somehow she knew her life would never be the same again. Amara's heart pounded as she sat at her desk outside Ethan's office, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. The whispers and stares from the employees still lingered in her mind. She had expected them to stop after a few days. But they hadn't. In fact, they had gotten worse. She's just a nobody. Where did Mr. Blackwell even find her? She must have something on him. There's no way he'd hire a girl like that. She tried to ignore them, tried to focus on her work, but it wasn't easy. She had stepped into a world where she was unwelcome, a place where she had to prove herself every single day. And Ethan? He was as unreadable as ever. Some days, he was cold and distant, giving her orders without looking at her. Other days, he was different, watching her closely, testing her, as if waiting for her to fail. But Amara refused to give up. She worked harder than anyone else in that building, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the others had gone. She studied, learned, and absorbed everything she could. Slowly, she started to understand the business, started to find her rhythm. And then, something unexpected happened. Ethan began to trust her. One evening, Amara was still at her desk, finishing up reports, when Ethan's voice startled her. "You should go home." She looked up to see him leaning against the doorway of his office, his eyes unreadable. "I still have some work to." "Amara." His voice was firm. "Go home." She hesitated, then nodded. As she packed her things, she realized something. He never called her by her name before. It had always been Miss Duru, or simply you. But tonight, he had said it softly, like it meant something. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And Amara was no longer just an assistant. She had become Ethan's most trusted employee, the one person he relied on. He started bringing her to meetings, introducing her to powerful people. She handled million-dollar deals, negotiated contracts, and earned the respect of those who once doubted her. Even the whispers in the office had changed. She's actually brilliant. I heard Mr. Blackwell lets her make decisions now. She might be the most powerful woman in this company soon. And then, just when Amara thought she had finally secured her place in this world, disaster struck. One morning, Ethan walked into the office with a storm in his eyes. His jaw was clenched, his fists tight. Something was wrong. Inside. Now. His voice was sharp as he pointed toward his office. Amara followed, confusion twisting inside her. The moment the door shut behind them, Ethan threw a folder onto the desk. Explain this. She hesitated before picking it up. Her stomach dropped. Inside were bank statements with large sums of money missing. This wasn't me, she said immediately, panic creeping into her voice. Ethan's eyes were dark. Then who was it? She flipped through the documents. The transactions had her signature. Her mind raced. This was a setup. I swear, Ethan, I didn't do this. He exhaled sharply, pacing the room. I want to believe you, Amara. But I've trusted people before, and they betrayed me. Her chest tightened. You think I would do that to you? Silence. Then, I don't know, he admitted, his voice low. The words felt like a slap. After everything, he still doubted her. But before Amara could speak, the office door burst open. A man in a suit stormed in, throwing more documents on the desk. Mr. Blackwell, we've traced the transactions. They were made from Miss Duru's account. Amara's blood ran cold. This was bad. Really, really bad. Security was called. The police arrived. And just like that, Amara was being escorted out of the building in front of everyone. The same people who once whispered about her now stood watching, some smirking, others gasping in shock. She wanted to scream that it was a lie, that she was being framed. But no one would listen. And Ethan? He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable. The betrayal in his eyes was unbearable. Did he really believe she was a thief? The next 48 hours were a nightmare. The police questioned her. She had no lawyer, no one to defend her. Everything seemed against her. Until something happened. Ethan came. He walked into the interrogation room, his gaze locked on hers. I know the truth. Amara swallowed hard. And what is the truth, Ethan? His jaw tightened. You were framed. Tears filled her eyes. She had spent the last 2 days wondering if he would ever believe her. Who did it? She whispered. Ethan sat down, exhaling deeply. Someone from inside the company. Someone who wanted you out. The truth unraveled like a twisted game. One of Ethan's board members, Mr. Kingston, had orchestrated the entire setup. He had stolen the money and framed Amara because he saw her as a threat. Ethan had confronted him, gathering evidence, and finally, the truth had come out. Amara was free, but the damage had already been done. Her heart was shattered. She looked at Ethan, the man who had saved her once, the man who had given her everything, and she saw doubt in his eyes. For even a second, he had believed she was guilty, and that hurt more than anything. Amara left. Not just the company, she left Ethan. She needed time to heal, time to understand who she was outside of him. But Ethan, he wasn't done with her. Months passed. Amara rebuilt herself. She started her own business, using the skills she had learned under Ethan. Though she proved to herself that she didn't need a billionaire to survive. And then, one night, there was a knock on her door. She opened it. Ethan stood there, looking at her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered. I was wrong, he said. I should have never doubted you. Amara's heart pounded. I let my past cloud my judgment, he continued. But the truth is, Amara, I need you. Tears filled her eyes. She had loved him once. Maybe she still did. But could she trust him again? Silence stretched between them. Then she stepped aside. Ethan walked in, and just like that, a new chapter began.